The story opens in a city where people loved talking about success stories but quietly ignored the kids they once laughed at, and right at the center of this unbelievable chain of events stood a quiet student named Ethan Carter, a boy who walked into school every morning wearing the same faded shirt, patched shoes, and a backpack stitched together so many times it practically carried its own scars. Most students ignored him, some whispered about him, but the part that genuinely blew my mind was that even one teacher, the very person meant to guide students, treated his appearance like a public joke, turning embarrassment into a routine Ethan had no escape from. Nobody in that classroom could have imagined what those humiliating moments were planting inside him, because years later, when that same city desperately needed hope, the quiet kid everyone overlooked would return holding something nobody saw coming: power, success, and the chance to rewrite everything. 2. Ethan Carter grew up in the kind of neighborhood people only mentioned when talking about struggle, the kind of place where broken fences leaned sideways like they had already given up and every winter somehow felt colder when bills stacked higher than hope. His mother worked exhausting shifts cleaning office buildings at night while his father had disappeared from the picture years earlier, leaving behind unpaid debt and silence heavy enough to settle over the house like dust. Ethan learned early that survival came before pride, which explained why his clothes looked worn long before they should have. Shirts came from donation bins, shoes were repaired with glue instead of replaced, and backpacks lasted years longer than they ever should. But despite everything, the kid carried himself quietly, almost strangely calm, as if somewhere deep inside he believed life had to become something bigger eventually. Bro, hearing stories like this always hits hard because real life genuinely works this way sometimes. The people carrying the heaviest struggles often stay the quietest. School, however, became the one place Ethan hoped life might improve, and unfortunately it turned into the exact opposite. His middle school classroom revolved around one teacher named Mr. Raymond Holloway, a respected educator who cared deeply about grades, discipline, and public image, but carried an ugly habit of humiliating students under the excuse of teaching lessons. Ethan became an easy target almost immediately. Every missed supply item became public attention. Every ripped sleeve somehow turned into a moment for sarcastic remarks disguised as motivation. It never crossed outright cruel lines that would get headlines or complaints, which honestly made it worse because everything sat in that uncomfortable gray area people brush off with phrases like, "He probably didn't mean it like that." But intent stops mattering when embarrassment becomes routine. 3. Whenever Ethan walked late into class after helping his exhausted mother in the mornings, Mr. Holloway somehow found ways to make the moment sting. If Ethan forgot materials, the teacher made examples about responsibility. If his shoes looked worn, comments about presentation somehow entered lectures. Students laughed because teenagers follow energy, and once someone becomes socially marked, the crowd usually joins in without thinking twice. That part felt painfully real to me because classrooms can become brutal ecosystems where one person gets quietly pushed to the bottom while everybody pretends nothing serious is happening. Ethan rarely reacted. That was the strange thing. He didn't argue, didn't cry publicly, didn't storm out. He just sat there taking notes with laser focus, almost like every humiliating moment was getting quietly filed somewhere in his memory. After school he rushed home, worked odd neighborhood jobs, helped his mother with groceries, and somehow still managed grades good enough to surprise people. Teachers called him gifted but distant. Students labeled him weird. Nobody actually stopped to ask what survival looked like behind closed doors. Then came the moment that shifted something permanently. One rainy afternoon during a classroom presentation, Ethan stood near the front trying to explain a science project built mostly from recycled scraps because buying materials simply wasn't possible. Before he could even finish, Mr. Holloway interrupted and turned attention toward Ethan's appearance again, tying together a smug lesson about preparation and effort while students chuckled under their breath. The room laughed harder than usual that day, and Ethan stood frozen, holding his homemade project while humiliation spread across the classroom like wildfire. And what happened after school that evening would quietly change the trajectory of his entire life. For that rainy afternoon stayed with Ethan in a way humiliation usually does when it stops feeling temporary and starts feeling permanent. He walked home through streets soaked in cold water, carrying the science project that now felt heavier than bricks, replaying every laugh in his head until embarrassment slowly transformed into something sharper. Not anger exactly, something quieter, colder, more dangerous in the long run, determination. The strange thing about being underestimated is that eventually it stops hurting and starts teaching. Ethan began noticing patterns, realizing nobody expected anything from him except struggle, and somehow that realization became fuel. Bro, this part genuinely got to me because life sometimes pushes people into a corner where giving up almost feels reasonable, but every once in a while someone responds by becoming unstoppable. Money problems escalated fast at home. His mother's health began slipping after endless overnight shifts, overdue notices piled up, and there were nights when dinner looked more like survival than food. Ethan picked up extra work wherever possible, unloading boxes, repairing bicycles, cleaning garages, tutoring younger kids for small cash payments. Sleep became optional. Stress became routine. Yet instead of falling behind, his grades quietly climbed. Teachers started noticing impossible test scores. Scholarship forms appeared. Competitions opened doors he never imagined touching. But success brought resentment too, because classmates who once ignored him suddenly whispered that he was trying too hard, acting strange, making everybody look bad simply by refusing to quit. Meanwhile, Mr. Holloway only grew harsher, almost irritated by Ethan's growing competence. The same student once laughed at now started outperforming nearly everyone academically, and every achievement somehow invited fresh scrutiny. Tiny mistakes became public lessons. Recognition came paired with humiliation. It was subtle enough for outsiders to miss but heavy enough to follow Ethan everywhere. Then one evening, while helping clean a dusty storage room at a local community center for extra money, Ethan stumbled across something nobody expected him to notice, an opportunity hidden inside a pile of forgotten books, paperwork, and old city records that would quietly become the first domino in a comeback so massive this city would one day struggle to believe it ever overlooked him. Inside that forgotten storage room, surrounded by broken furniture and shelves nobody touched for years, Ethan discovered stacks of abandoned educational grant files, city redevelopment reports, and scholarship archives meant for struggling districts that somehow had never fully reached the people they were supposed to help. Most people would have walked right past them, but Ethan had developed something powerful through hardship: attention. He sat for hours after work reading faded documents under weak fluorescent lights, realizing there were millions allocated across years for community education, school partnerships, vocational programs, and low-income student advancement, yet somehow neighborhoods like his still looked abandoned. That realization genuinely shocked me because this is exactly the kind of thing people overlook in real life. Resources exist, systems exist, but the people who need help most often never even hear about them. Something shifted inside Ethan after that. He became obsessed, not with revenge yet, but with understanding how power actually worked. While classmates spent weekends chasing distractions, Ethan buried himself inside libraries, free online courses, old business books, city planning articles, and education case studies. He earned scholarships, entered academic competitions, and eventually secured admission into a respected university where survival still stayed difficult but possibility suddenly looked real. He worked brutal hours, lived cheaply, and quietly built connections with mentors who noticed the same thing everyone else ignored. Ethan had unusual patience. He wasn't chasing fast success. He studied systems. Years passed, and while the city forgot the quiet kid in worn clothes, Ethan slowly entered education technology, real estate partnerships, and community investment projects surrounding underfunded neighborhoods. Small wins became larger ones. One smart investment turned into another. A tutoring nonprofit became profitable educational software. Partnerships multiplied. Money followed impact. And then came the twist nobody, including Ethan himself, expected. The exact district where he once sat humiliated inside a classroom announced a financial collapse severe enough that schools faced shutdowns, layoffs, and permanent decline. The city panicked. And sitting miles away, reviewing reports in an office nobody imagined he could ever own, Ethan Carter quietly realized something unbelievable. He suddenly had the power to decide what happened next. Ethan stared at the district reports long after everyone else in the office had gone home, watching numbers paint a brutal picture of collapsing infrastructure, teacher shortages, unsafe buildings, and students quietly slipping through a system already running on fumes. The strangest part was realizing the school at the center of the crisis was the exact one where years earlier he had stood frozen, gripping a recycled science project while laughter filled the room. Life has a weird sense of timing sometimes, and I genuinely couldn't believe where this was headed when everything started connecting. The kid once mocked for patched shoes was now sitting behind conference tables worth more than his childhood apartment, being asked by investors and city officials whether he wanted to join a proposal that could completely reshape education across the region. 7 By then, Ethan had become something nobody saw coming, wealthy, respected, and quietly influential. His education company had exploded in value after helping struggling schools modernize affordable learning systems, and his investments in neglected communities unexpectedly transformed entire neighborhoods. But unlike flashy entrepreneurs chasing headlines, Ethan stayed private. No dramatic interviews. No giant speeches. Just relentless work. Which somehow made what happened next feel even heavier. When city leaders approached him about funding partnerships to save public schools, Ethan saw the opportunity instantly, not for destruction, not for humiliation, but for something far more powerful. Accountability. He proposed something nobody expected, building an entirely new educational campus, the largest and most advanced school network the city had ever seen, focused specifically on students overlooked by poverty. Scholarships, meals, career training, counseling, technology access, mentorship, things he once desperately needed would become standard. News spread fast. Local headlines exploded. Donations followed. Politicians praised the plan. Parents cried during town hall meetings. Then came the invitation ceremony. To celebrate the launch, district officials invited former educators, administrators, and community figures to recognize the transformation. And sitting quietly on that guest list, almost hidden among dozens of names, was one Ethan hadn't seen in years. Mr. Raymond Holloway. The same teacher who once turned humiliation into routine would soon walk into a building funded, designed, and created by the student he underestimated. And Ethan had already decided exactly how he planned to handle it. Not with yelling. Not revenge scenes from movies. Something colder. Something unforgettable. The ceremony arrived with cameras flashing, reporters filling hallways, and city leaders proudly touring a campus so massive it barely resembled anything the district had imagined possible. Ethan stood near the center of it all, calm and composed, watching students walk through bright classrooms, scholarship offices, technology labs, wellness centers, libraries, and career spaces built specifically for kids society usually overlooked. Every corner of the school quietly reflected struggles nobody else had seen him survive. That detail honestly hit harder than any dramatic revenge scene because this was not success built to impress rich investors, it was success built to protect kids from becoming forgotten. When former educators arrived, Mr. Holloway entered like everyone else, older now, quieter, carrying the weight of years in ways difficult to hide. And instead of public humiliation, dramatic confrontation, or bitterness, Ethan did something nobody expected. During recognition speeches and presentations, records of contributors, founders, and inspirations highlighted one undeniable truth: the entire mission of the school existed because Ethan never forgot what public embarrassment felt like and how deeply poverty shaped opportunity. Without naming blame directly, every word landed with quiet force. The message sat in the room heavier than anger ever could. One careless adult had helped create the determination behind the city's biggest educational comeback. The moment that truly changed everything came afterward, when staff and guests toured the building and saw a plaque near the entrance dedicated to students judged before being understood. It carried a simple belief woven into the entire project: talent exists everywhere, opportunity does not. Bro, that part genuinely blew my mind because revenge usually looks loud in movies, but real-life comeback energy sometimes looks like building something so meaningful that the people who doubt